In the evening of the 13th of July, 1732, three Mi'kmaq men paid René Leblanc a visit. They had come to the Acadian village of Grand Pre to threaten Leblanc and force him to stop building a blockhouse for the British. "All the Leblancs are dogs and villains, except for Francois," the men told Leblanc. They had a dagger for him if he continued to work for the British, for King George had conquered Annapolis, but not Minas. I love to use this vignette when I discuss 18th century Mi'kmaq, Acadia, or Nova Scotia. It helps express the depth and complexity of the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and Acadians. It reveals the tensions that developed between these communities as the Acadian population increased and the British sought to expand their influence beyond the walls of the garrison at Annapolis Royal. In this example, the Mi'kmaq knew where Leblanc lived and that he was working for the British. They knew his brother Francois and sought to distinguish Francois' activities from René's. They also likely knew that there was a British officer visiting Leblanc, providing them the opportunity to articulate their sovereignty over the region. The event challenges monolithic depictions of both the Acadian and Mi'kmaq communities. Constrained by the limited nature of the source material, historians have tended to discuss both groups, but particularly the Mi'kmaq, as homogeneous, with little internal social, economic, or political division. Today I'd like to demonstrate to you how two sources, the 1708 Mi'kmaq census and the Acadian parish registers, help us better understand the diversity of experiences that shaped Mi'kmaq and Acadian decision-making during the first half of the 18th century. In 1708, Antoine Gaulin, the first missionary in nearly a century to work in peninsular Mi'kmaq, that is, modern-day Nova Scotia, was charged with taking a nominal census of the Mi'kmaq. He recorded the names, ages, and family groupings of about 800 people living in the 7 communities on the map behind me: Port Royal, Cape Sable, La Have, Minas, Musquodoboit, Cape Breton, and Chignecto. It's very likely that Gaulin, who had only begun actively serving as a Roman Catholic missionary to the Mi'kmaq, was not very familiar with their population, and therefore undercounted. Although his purpose was primarily to assess how many Mi'kmaq men might be able to support the French in the event of an attack, the details within the census provide the most specific information about 18th century Mi'kmaq that we have available. Knowing the age, family relationships, and community affiliation of the Mi'kmaq in the census allows us to calculate child-women ratios. In the absence of more detailed source material, child-women ratios are a useful tool for assessing a society's fertility. So the census allows us to compare the number of children under 5 born to married women between the ages of 15 and 49. And this is an ideal technique for the 17th and 18th century, where under normal circumstances, the interval between births and for the average woman is about 28 months, so just about 2 years. A married woman then will have had at least one child within this time period, but only a handful will have had none or 2 or more. A community with a child-woman ratio below 1 would be considered to have lower than average fertility, while a society with a ratio above 1 would have had higher than average. Although lower than the child-woman ratios for the neighboring Acadians at Port Royal, seen in the last 2 rows of this table, most Mi'kmaq communities had child-woman ratios around 1. This suggests that the overall Mi'kmaq population was relatively healthy and had few constraints on their ability to reproduce. In fact, this ratio is nearly identical to the ratio for the Maritimes calculated using the 1901 census by Peter Gossage and Danielle Govreau, which was 0.96, and about 25% larger than turn-of-the-century Ontario, which was 0.75. And this is somewhat surprising given the general consensus that fertility in sedentary agricultural societies like Nova Scotia or Ontario was actually quite a bit higher than in societies like the Mi'kmaq, which had to move frequently to maintain their supply of food. These figures also directly challenge the argument that the Mi'kmaq population was in decline throughout this period. On the contrary, these ratios suggest that the effects of frequent migration or periodic malnutrition didn't seriously limit Mi'kmaq women's ability to reproduce. Despite the overall robust nature of these child-women ratios, however, the Mi'kmaq communities living closer to the places used by European settlers, traders, and fishers, particularly Port Royal, Cape Sable, and Minas, were not as healthy as those living further away. The Mi'kmaq in these places comprised about 30% of the total Mi'kmaq population. Here, they directly competed with Europeans for local resources and were more likely to come into contact with European diseases. Over time, the growth of European settlements limited Mi'kmaq access to some resources, forcing them to migrate more frequently in order to sustain their families. Recurrent migration likely increased the stress placed on women, lowering their nutrition while increasing their workload. Both of these changes would have affected the frequency with which women could conceive, limiting their family size. Given the difference in child-women ratios, it seems likely that most Mi'kmaq households during the 18th century were part of stable and relatively sedentary communities, while migration played a more important role for households living closer to Acadian settlers. These divisions had important consequences for the Mi'kmaq and shaped local decision-making in the decades following the British conquest of Acadia in 1710. By the mid-1720s and early 1730s, Mi'kmaq communities around the principal European settlements, and even in recently established Ile Royale, also known as Cape Breton, began to migrate away, often joining more distant Mi'kmaq communities. Most moved to Beaubassin, Tatamagouche, Shubenacadie, and Antigonish, seen in pink in the upper part of Nova Scotia on the map behind me. And this was roughly the geography described as Chignecto in the 1708 census. The Mi'kmaq in the southwestern part of Mi'kmaqi, however, also migrated, and they went to La Have, marked in red down in the lower right-hand corner of the map. With New England fishers now much more active at Canso and along Mi'kmaqi's eastern coast, and the French established on Cape Breton Island and the British at Annapolis, these locations remained two of the places where neither European power had a significant presence. And significantly, they were also the only two places where the 1708 census suggests that the Mi'kmaq were most likely to support a robust population. So the census provides considerable insight into why the Mi'kmaq forcefully reacted to René Leblanc's decision to help the British build a blockhouse at Grand Pre. Even in the period before the British conquest of Port Royal, there were significant demographic factors pushing the Mi'kmaq away from European settlement and causing them to be weary of European expansion. The blockhouse didn't just represent the physical extension of European power in the region, but it also symbolized the influence that Europeans had on the Mi'kmaq population around Grand Pre. But where the census illustrates friction between Aboriginal and European people in peninsular Mi'kmaqi, the parish registers reveal a more positive, but also limited, sense of interaction. The parish registers have been discounted as a source too fragmented to be useful for historians. Indeed, there's not a single Acadian parish for which we have a complete record. Mi'kmaq participation in Catholic rites in these parishes is even more fragmented. The parish registers from Saint Jean-Baptiste at Port Royal, which I'm going to focus on today, are the most complete, extending from 1702 to 1755. But even here, there are only 55 of over 3,500 acts that involve a Mi'kmaq person. Records survive from 1707 to 1748 for the parish of Saint-Charles-des-Mines at Grand Pre, but there are only 5 acts that involve a Mi'kmaq man or woman. The parish registers from Notre-Dame de Bon Secours at Beaubassin are the least complete, covering the early 1680s and 1730s, as well as most of the 1710s and 1740s. They also contain only 5 acts that involve the Mi'kmaq. In total, there are 65 parish records involving 23% of the total Mi'kmaq population and only 5% of the Acadians, so there's no ignoring the fact that these records shed little light on the experiences of the vast majority of Acadians and Mi'kmaq living in this region. Today, however, I would like to take a slightly different approach to these records. If we shift our emphasis from the study of intermarriage to a focus on the peripheral people who participated as witnesses and sponsors in these acts, a picture of Acadian and Mi'kmaq social networks begins to emerge. For the sake of time, I'm only going to focus today on Port Royal. On the screen behind me, I have visualized the 55 acts in the parish registers in order to demonstrate how the Acadians and Mi'kmaq were connected to each other. Here, the red dots signify the acts, The green dots represent Mi'kmaq participants, and the pink dots represent the Acadians. It's important to recognize that this does not mean that everyone in the network knew each other. Rather, all Acadians and Mi'kmaq in the network were within 1 to 2 degrees. That is, they knew someone who knew someone from a different religious ceremony involving the Mi'kmaq at the Port Royal Church. In this image, 38 of these acts involve people who lived in an interconnected social world. But importantly, when the parents of the Acadians are added to this visualization, the interconnections between the acts become much more striking. Now, 46 parish records are connected, leaving only 18 Acadians and 26 Mi'kmaq outside of the networks. Most of these records are linked by family relationships. The Robichauds were by far the most pivotal family linking these parish records, and they were likely the family most closely associated with the Mi'kmaq living around Port Royal. If we look at only links that are 3 degrees or less from Prudent Robichaud, the patriarch of the family after the conquest, we can see that he was connected to almost all of the interior relationships in this network. And indeed, these connections are represented by the yellow nodes on the image on the screen. And if we look at 2 degrees of separation or less, and that's smaller than what's depicted here, but I don't have a representation due to the limitations of the software, we can see that he was connected to 27 Mi'kmaq and 27 Acadians through 10 acts. These relationships, I believe, are indicative of the important role Robichaud played as a liaison between the Acadians and Mi'kmaq. And in fact, Robichaud is one of the few Acadians mentioned in official correspondence as having had a relationship with these people. Although no other family can be as easily or directly linked to the Mi'kmaq, the Pellerin and Savoie families were also overrepresented in the parish records relative to other Acadian families. They both had at least 5 family members participate in religious ceremonies with the Mi'kmaq. The Pellerin family, its network shown here in yellow, was linked through a Étienne Pellerin, and was connected by 2 degrees or less, again not represented in the yellow here, to 11 Mi'kmaq and 21 Acadians through 5 acts. Germain Savoie connected the Savoie family through similar relationships to 9 Mi'kmaq and 21 Acadians through 4 acts. But these families were not as distinct as they appear in the last 2 images, because this network does not describe sibling relationships. The Savoies and Pellerins were interconnected through Jeanne Savoie, Germain Savoie's older sister, and Etienne's wife. And if we treat them as one family, the Pellerin Savoies had relationships similar to the Robichauds. They were connected to 9 acts, 20 Mi'kmaq, and 42 Acadians. All 3 families had Aboriginal connections. Importantly, they seem to have been just as connected to the Abenaki as the Mi'kmaq, a fact that reflects the important influence of the Abenaki on Port Royal during the 17th and early 18th century. Etienne and Jeanne's son, François, for example, married Marie Martin, the daughter of Pierre Martin, and an Abenaki woman named Marie West-West. The Robichauds were also connected to the Abenaki through François' wife, Marie Leborn de Belle-Isle, whose mother Mathilde was the daughter of Matawakando, a Penobscot chief. The family had other connections to the Mi'kmaq through Prudent's wife, Henriette Petitpas, whose brother, Claude, had married a Mi'kmaq woman named Marie-Thérèse. Similarly, François Savoie, Germain's son, married Henriette Petitpas' niece, Marie Richard, also connecting them to the Petitpas family. And finally, the Pellerin and the Robichauds lived at the Cape, which was a common fishing site for the Mi'kmaq around Port Royal, demonstrating the way some of these social networks may have been geographically determined. Taken together, these 3 family networks connected 33% of the acts in the parish registers, comprising 37% of the Acadians and 27% of the Mi'kmaq. There are a number of conclusions that can be drawn from these 2 sources. The first, and relatively well-established conclusion, is that when the entire populations are taken into account, the parish registers suggest that few Acadians and Mi'kmaq interacted during the 18th century. This makes sense when set alongside the child-women ratios derived from the 1708 census. Mi'kmaq communities living near European settlement had greater difficulty reproducing themselves than those living further away. There was little reason for the Mi'kmaq to remain near European settlements long enough to regularly draw on the services of the Acadian parish priests. As the Acadian population and the European imperial presence increased, the Mi'kmaq moved further from Acadian settlement and the French and British administrative centers. The census and parish registers also suggest that we should resist the temptation to overemphasize the importance of intermarriage between the Acadian and Mi'kmaq communities. In his nominal census, Gallen separated the Acadian and Mi'kmaq communities with little reference to their intermixing. Although there is some evidence of intermarriage, particularly in the Meuse family, there are few French family names listed in his enumeration of the Mi'kmaq. Indeed, Gallen knew the Mi'kmaq well enough to determine their names, ages, and family relationships. If an Acadian had been living among them at the time of the census, it seems likely that their presence would have been noted. Intermarriage between these communities, as Bill Wicken and others have noted, existed primarily in the 17th century. Its legacy, however, likely explains the existence of the social networks depicted through the 18th century parish registers. The Robichaud, Pellerin, Savoie families in Port Royal, and the Cyr and Cormier families in Beaubassin, which I haven't had time to discuss today, were involved with the Mi'kmaq in a disproportionately large number of religious ceremonies relative to their Acadian neighbors. Although the Mi'kmaq and Acadians generally drifted apart over time, relationships between these specific Mi'kmaq and Acadian families continued to link these societies together. Taken together, these two sources suggest that caution should be taken when studying the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq. Not all Mi'kmaq and Acadians were in the same situation. The sparse nature of evidence about these people encourages generalization, but this practice can occlude as much as it can illuminate. Local conditions mattered when it came to determining how the Mi'kmaq engaged with European settlers and imperial officials. These sources suggest that, for the most part, these societies lived apart, and that there were only a handful of instances where meaningful relationships were established. Thank you.